want to talk about some things, though, that are very serious and need to be mentioned, and that is that there seems to be a world outcry against the use of genetically modified organisms, what we call GMOs, or genetically modified crops, GMCs, or genetically engineered. You hear GE. And I want to make the case that genetically modified anything is not the serious problem that people would have us believe. Let me give you some examples. Teosinte is shown here on the left. Teosinte is a grass, originally grew in Mesoamerica, and it has been genetically modified over the centuries to form corn. So my point is that humans have been genetically modifying crops since humans have been on the planet. And we've gone from something that's a grass-like product to something like modern-day maize or corn. So genetically modified crops are not the terrible thing that people would have us believe. For whatever reason, people particularly in Europe, and you can see on this map some of the countries that have resisted using genetically modified crops, Europe being one of them, sadly Africa being another, when we know pretty conclusively that genetically modified crops are safe. Here's some interesting statistics. We have allowed, since 1985, we approved genetically engineered crops. And in 1994, we came up with a genetically engineered tomato, which delayed ripening so that in the mass production of potatoes, we could get them to, or tomatoes I should say, we could get them to market quicker without them spoiling. Kind of important when you're trying to feed a world. In 2015, 12% of the world used genetically engineered crops, and 50% of the farms in America use some form of genetically engineered crop. Those are, I think, very good numbers. We've been doing this for a long time, and we have not seen adverse conditions, even though a lot of our environmental organizations, Greenpeace in particular, have fought vigorously against the use of genetically modified crops. And you can see in this map, Africa and Europe are particularly bad. Russia is particularly bad. But I would argue that genetically modified crops, from a scientific point of view, are healthy, safe, and good for the environment. And I can back that up with research that's been done. Before I do that, let's take a look at Africa. I will tell you right now that Africa is the last place in the world that should be resisting the use of genetically engineered crops. We need to increase the production of crops in places like Africa so that they can have a higher life expectancy and a healthier life. This is a mystery to me as to why or how we got this knee-jerk reaction from the environmental groups. There are three major ways to produce genetically engineered crops. The first way is that we make them genetically resistant. We give them traits to resist certain kinds of pesticides. Once again, I don't like using pesticides, but if you're going to use a pesticide, it's better to use that pesticide that doesn't kill the crop than it is to kill the crop. That makes kind of common sense. So that's one kind. A second kind is to use insect-resistant traits in there. A critter lands on a crop, starts eating it, and dies. That's good for, again, for feeding the world. And then, of course, there's virus-resistant traits that give these crops the ability to resist viruses. So all three of those things are important, and we need them if we're going to continue to increase the world production of crops. We have other things that we put into crops, drought tolerance, non-browning, for example, in potatoes and apples, various colors in flowers, and here's some cool things. we attempt to put the stability of oil to suppress trans fats, which are bad for us, and the enhancement of omega-3 fatty acids, which are good for us. And we try to put those into these crops so we can get healthier things from our crops. I got cases where I've seen people screaming about using pesticide-resistant crops and then getting rid of the genetically engineered crops and going out there then and growing the regular crops that aren't genetically engineered, and then bombarding them with the pesticide and putting up with death to some of the crops. It's crazy kind of stuff. So perhaps the best story I can tell you is Greenpeace and other organizations' movement against golden rice. Golden rice was developed back in the 1980s, and the company that came up with it, they gave it away for free to use to help the impoverished world. What it does is it put a trait in there that gives the rice vitamin A. It produces naturally vitamin A. Countries like India and the Philippines, they have people going blind and dying by the thousands every year because they don't get enough vitamin A. So here's a crop that is healthy for everyone and gives them vitamin A. But for whatever reason, Greenpeace has fought this tooth and nail in India and in Philippines, and still today, in 2016, we do not have yellow rice being grown in, golden rice, excuse me, being grown in India or in the Philippines. That's crazy, and we need to stop this. We need to hold these environmental organizations responsible for the number of casualties we're having because they're trying to fight the use of genetically engineered crops. Now, why do I say that they're safe? It's because the finest scientific body in the world has come together and they've studied genetically modified crops, and they have come to the conclusion, this is the National Academy of Science. It is not a government organization. It is an independent group. They are made up of the finest scientists in the United States, and they came together to study and gave a 407-page report that just came out in 2016 called Genetically Engineered Crops, Experiences and Prospects. And they have they reviewed decades of use of genetically engineered crops, and they've concluded that they are economically beneficial, safe for humans and livestock, and have adequate regulation. I mean, you know, all kinds, I guess, of terrible things can happen from anything, but this is as safe as we're going to ever know it is. And so I urge you to not support, if you will, this movement against genetically engineered crops. If we're going to continue to feed the world, we need genetically engineered crops. Okay, enough with the comments on genetically engineered crops. Let's talk about renewable resources, because this is another way that we can help global warming and also help with the growth of enough food and do it green-wise, at the same time not burning fossil fuels that hurt our environment. And there are three major renewable energies, and as you can see from the chart, renewable energies as of 2013 were 19%. It's a little bit bigger now, but that's remarkable. It was years ago that was just a little tiny sliver, and now all over the world people are starting to use renewable energy. That's good news. Three different types are the sun, where we try to capture the sun directly through the voltaic cells. Another one is wind, where we capture the energy generated by wind. And the third is through flowing water, we can generate electricity. Let's talk about the first one, flowing water. You build a dam, you put a generator in there, and you generate a lot of electricity. This is Hoover Dam, that's Lake Mead behind it. And Hoover Dam generates most of the electricity, maybe all of the electricity as far as I know, for Las Vegas. So we have an immense amount of energy being generated here, and all of that energy is free. Now let's talk about the problems with dams in general, because whenever you do something that looks good, you're going to cause some bad effects. If there's no other message to you that I leave you with, I hope it's that. Lake Mead is a lake with lots of potable water in it. So you've generated this beautiful lake that can be used for recreation. It can be used as drinking water along the Colorado River, and you get electricity to boot. Again, the problems though are you've created a surface of more water being exposed to the atmosphere, so you get a lot more evaporation. So we're losing in an arid southwest. It's not a good place to have a lake because it's going to evaporate faster because it's wet. So there's one bad thing about it. Second bad thing is you've got sandstones below Lake Mead now that were not in touch with the water. They're now in touch with water, and they're taking water away. Those sandstones are porous. The water flows through them. They're permeable, taking away the water. And there are, I think, 7 or 8 states in Mexico that had to come up with a treaty to agree upon how much water each state was going to get. And at the end of the day, we're wasting a lot of that water by creating these lakes. Am I saying get rid of the dams? Not at all. But I am saying that there is a cause and effect. There's some bad things that are going to happen with anything like this. For example, when you use the water for agriculture in and along the Colorado River, that water goes out and it gets salt out of the soils. It brings those salts back into the river, so the salinity of the river increases. Let's take a look at the next diagram. This is an example of solar energy. This is Topaz Solar Farm in California. It's out in Southern California. It's a nice place to have a solar farm because in solar farms you are exposed to an immense amount of sunlight. And as you can see, these cells that are put out there can cover large regions. That's a kilometer mark there, so this stretches over kilometers of areas. And you then can store energy through batteries from the sun. It's a great place because you have so much sunlight. You can only do this in places where you do have a lot of sunlight. And obviously out in Southern California, you do have a lot of sunlight. The bad news is that you can't use this area for agriculture. And so we have a situation then where using solar energy, you have to do it in places where you probably wouldn't grow crops. And California, Southern California is probably a good place for that. But we can't do this everywhere because we need that land for agriculture. Let's talk about wind energy. This has become very popular. And one of the nice things about wind energy is you can grow agriculture near these wind turbines. There are some problems with wind, a lot of complaints. You know, you try to do something good, you're going to find somebody that doesn't like it. Well, apparently the noise from these wind turbines bothers a lot of people. A lot of people are bothered because they're unsightly. And the third complaint is, of course, and this is a serious one, I think, is that these turbines kill birds. So I think we have to be worried about the impact. This is the Brazos wind farm out in Texas, I believe. So I think you're being a little persnickety about the noise problem and the unsightly problem, since it is something that is renewable and we're not using our fossil fuels up. So that's where I'll leave you with the environment. I hope that I've given you a nice summary, and if you want further things to read, check out my website, and you'll find some essays on these various subjects.